Hello again, class. We're going to continue our discussion about history in general, but focus on one of the really important aspects of what historians do and also what you will do in any sort of history class, and that is read sources, especially primary sources, and that's what we're going to put our focus in this session today.
What you see here is an example of cuneiform during Xerxes I's reign, and this is a situation where I need someone else's help to be able to read this. I cannot read cuneiform. And so this isn't always the case when it comes to sources that we read. Sometimes they're in English or they're just in difficult wording. But I want to emphasize the different types of sources. This would be an example of a primary source, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more depth in just a little bit here. But there's also a situation where someone else has done interpretation for you, or in a secondary source. And so let's talk about the difference between those. So a primary source is often a first-hand account, or it's something that's been created by someone from the time period of study. So in the example of the cuneiform that we saw, clearly someone had to create that during a specific time. And so it's something that is from that time period of study. An example of this could be journals, it could be interviews, it could be artifacts. If we think about, for instance, video, you could consider a YouTube video where someone's talking about their day as an example of a primary source. Secondary sources are someone else's interpretation of primary sources, so they're usually the combination of many different primary sources in order to get to an understanding of something, maybe a time period or an event or something like that. This could be textbooks, articles, reference works, or to go back to the video example, maybe something that would also be on YouTube, but it would be something more like a documentary. So that would be an example of secondary and primary sources and the differences. Now, another important part of this that we need to talk about is bias. This is something that can be defined as an unfair or an unbalanced opinion, and I just want to emphasize that everyone has bias, and so it's not that it is something that we can completely remove, so it's always existing, but we can also control the degree to which it influences us. So we can't get rid of it, but we can control how much it influences us. And so being aware of it is a first step of that, of course. And we're going to talk about this in kind of a visual way as far as how this is something that affects source creation and also how you read sources. So let's think about source creation. First, let's start with a primary source. So in blue I have an historical event, and that is observed by someone. So we think about it as a historical observer, someone who has seen something happen or knows about it in some way or another. And between that is that observer's bias. And so bias is not just an opinion, but it's the way, it can be, for instance, the way that you view the world, the framework that you look through in order to understand the world. That can be something that becomes between someone observing something and an event that actually happens. They're interpreting it based on that. And then they create some sort of historical document. Or it doesn't necessarily always have to be a document. It could just be a source. For instance, I mentioned video before. But you'll more likely, depending on your topic and your time period, be looking at documents. So when you come to read those sources, it goes through an additional layer of bias, which is your bias. And so you have that historical source and you're looking at it, and so that your bias becomes between you and that source. And again, this is a process that can't be avoided, but we need to be aware of that. So there's a historical event that happened, and there's a lot of steps in between you and that event. So when we add secondary source in there, it means that someone has come between you and the historical source. So between historical source in this visual and the historian, for instance, it doesn't have to be an historian, but that's an example, there is their bias. And so then when you read or view or consume in some way what they produce, then there's your bias. And so you see that there's 3 levels of bias between you and an historical event. Now, this might make it look like this is a bad thing, and in some ways it can be if someone's bias is very, very strong, and so you want to be aware of that. But if you think about a secondary source, it means that historian, there might be an extra layer of bias there, but they probably know a lot more about the historical source than you do. And part of your process is to make sure, are they reliable? But if you do think they're reliable, then they are most likely an expert in that area, maybe that historical event or that source. And so they're pulling not just from one historical source, but maybe many sources. And so that can help you save a lot of time because you are not an expert in this. And so although there's multiple steps to that, it helps you understand something. But when we look at primary sources in this course, we're going to be taking you back to this process. And so you are taking out that middle person. And I don't want to make it seem like there's only one or the other. Both of these are important. So if we think about this, we could say that you need to look at the historical source, and you also need to see what the historian or someone else has said about it in a secondary source. So just wanted to provide you a high-level overview of the difference between primary and secondary sources.